Welcome everyone back to the channel. Today with the red carpet. For the first time in this channel, we are having, let's say, a top tier guest to enlighten us in all philosophical topics. But today's more of a special video because it is not intended purely on, addressing certain philosophical issues or certain Greek issues, but also making a tribute. Because my dear friend that is across me in the screen has just now entered the last leave, as he himself labeled it. So I'm here with Mr. Nicholas Denia. So how are you doing, Nick?
Hi, very well. I feel most honored to be invited. I'm most honored. Thank you.
So could you tell us all what is this, the final leave that you were talking about at some point?
It's like a sabbatical, but ordinary sabbaticals, you have to go back to work at the end of them. This is the sabbatical where I die at the end, so never have to return to work. Which,
Yeah.
I'm in the fortunate position of having retired from jobs that require me to do some tiresome things from time to time, but I remain a fellow of my college, which gives me all the good things that I can, including the opportunity to do some congenial teaching and so on. So it's the best of all worlds.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So, for people who may not know you, just as a brief introduction, Mr. Nicholas Denia is what I would label in ancient philosophy one of the living legends of Cambridge. So we had the opportunity to meet in 2019, and me as a, at the time, first year PhD student, I was, a bit scared going to Cambridge, or what's this going to be about? And then I met Nick.
Oh, it's nice to know I can scare some people, even if it's only first year PhDs. I'd love to be able to scare colleagues, but I never manage that.
Well, if you scared colleagues, I mean, you may be scared someone, I don't know, probably.
No, one of the most humiliating times I've ever had, sitting opposite a young woman, 6 or 7 at dinner. She started pulling faces at me. So I pulled faces back at her. So she pulled worse faces back. So I pulled my worst face back at her. Ooh. Then she said, you don't scare me one bit. I don't scare 6-year-old girls. I mean, what good am I?
Well, I don't know. But, academia sometimes is very particular. But I was expecting certain, like an aura of formality all across the city, not just the university. And then I met you that you were likely to, put your points passionately forward in a louder volume than the rest. And some of them were like, what's going on?
It's definite.
And yes. And as for me, I was like, this is so relaxing because I always try to restrain myself, let's say, in academic spaces. But after that, my academic life changed for the better, in the sense of, well, I can now feel more like myself here, and it will be okay.
Yeah.
So it's good. And as you can see, people, we both like colors, like we're very proud of this. But that's on my side of things. But this video will be intended to get to know you, Nick, a little bit better, and to tell us how has this path, let's say, this journey across top-tier academic philosophy been for you and the students you've met, and whatever you want to share with us. So I will start chronologically, let's say. So how did you start in philosophy or ancient Greek stuff?
Well, I started in philosophy as a little kid before I ever knew the name. I don't think I knew the name philosophy until much, much later, until teenage years. Mm-hmm. But I have memories as a little kid of looking at rain. Okay, I'm from Lancashire, rains a lot, right? But whenever it was raining in one spot on one hand, it would always be raining on the other hand. So if it's raining at a given point, it's always raining, a few feet from that point. So if it's raining a few feet, then it should be raining a few feet from that point, and from that point, and from that point, and so on and so on. So if it ever rains anywhere, it should be raining everywhere all at once. Okay.
If we follow that argument, yes.
Simple inductive argument. So, well, anyway, this puzzled me. I think there are now ways around it, but it was a pleasant thing to come, reading about inductive arguments, the Sorites paradox, and so on.
Yes.
There's people who earn a living thinking about that sort of thing. People will pay you money. Another childhood experience. I was looked after by my Auntie Vera. She, refugee lady, hungry. Okay, babysitter. So there was one time she was trying to get me to wash behind my ears.
Important.
I try. You know how adults have this funny thing about. Well, it's not just dogs. I noticed as well. They always like to clean you, right? So I argued. Well, what's the point of washing? I'll only get dirty again. Whereupon, and I won't reproduce a Hungarian accent. You might as well say, what's the point of eating? I'll only get hungry again.
Right.
It took my breath away. It was like a magic spell.
Well, it's a refutation in its own right.
Yeah, a refutation by parallel, showing that something that seemed all right in this context cannot be right because you see that the principle doesn't carry over elsewhere. Yes. So that okay. So quite apart from just the general policy of washing, this thought. So when I started to learn about logic, at a much later stage, it was a bit like an old friend. How can I do arguments? So the method of counterexample, how can I do arguments that will have that same magic, compelling force as my Auntie Vera's? So, that's all as a little kid. I mean, as a schoolboy, I had the good fortune to go to a school that, among other things, taught me Greek and introduced me to Plato. Also, there was a school philosophy society. We read Alfred Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic. And for a time, I was a really, really obnoxious teenage logical positivist.
Right. Yeah. We all go through that phase.
We all go through that. It's like acne, but most of us grow out of it. This was a very good thing, in a kind of destructive kind of way. I didn't realise that this had long been a combination of exploded and abandoned as totally hopeless. Maybe 10, 20 years before I was reading it, but that was okay. So that's how I came to know that some of these things that had interested me were actually called philosophy, and that other people did them and did them professionally. So then there were school discussion groups and so on. Then I went on to have a marvellous education as an undergraduate at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, where I did a bit of philosophy, a bit of classics, and I've been juggling the pair ever since.
Yes.
So that's how I came to be a philosopher.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
And that juggling both fields is actually the feeling you have permanently when you do ancient philosophy. Because it's never full time, any of them.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yes. Because it's you can't really do ancient philosophy without knowing a bit about other aspects of the ancient world, and you can't really do it without knowing an ancient philosophy. So you need to have the two. As for Greek, this was again something I was very fortunate in my schooling. At the age of 11, I went to Manchester Grammar School. Every boy had to start learning Latin and French. So we all did that for our first 2 years. And in French, we did really boring things. We studied the adventures of La Famille Bertillon, typical episode. The family would sit around the dining table in the salle à manger, and then they'd have a really stilted conversation in which they'd mention every item on the table. Où se trouve la fourchette de Madame Bertillon? Where is the fork of So, next exciting episode, you might move it out into the garden and name a plant. Right. In Latin, we read Julius Caesar all about duffing up the ancestors of much more fun. So then after a couple of years of that, we were offered the opportunity of adding a third language. And the choice was a choice between two modern ones, German and Russian, and ancient. So I thought, perhaps unjustly, that German and Russian, that'd be as boring as French. Whereas Greek, at least it might be a bit more like Caesar. And it turned out to be not quite like that for various reasons, but indeed much more interesting, much more entertaining. So that's how I came to know and love Greek.
Well, it sounds like you don't have any regrets from this decision.
Oh no. Well, it's always a good thing to know an extra language or two, but you can't learn everything, so you might as well learn the stuff that's congenial. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Normally, there is this formula, let's say, that is always said of difficult intellectual endeavors, like life is too short to learn German. Or life. I've read that one. I've read life is too short to learn ancient Greek. And the other one is a longer version, which is from chess. Like life is too long to learn chess, but that's not a fault of chess; it's a fault of life.
Well, I have a scheme which it's similar to my problem with the hands and the rain, to make learning languages, or at least learning some languages, fairly painless.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so it relies on the fact that, say, between the English that you and I are speaking now and the English that was spoken 50 years ago, okay, there's slight differences, but they're so subtle. So anybody who can follow our conversation now would easily be able to pick up what was going on in an English conversation 50 years ago. Right.
Yes.
And then if you've got 50 years, English of 50 years ago, it's easy to move back another 50 years before that.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea is you have a book, big book perhaps, begins with a chapter in present day English. Next chapter is in the English of 1972. Next chapter, by the time you get to the end of the 1972 English chapter, you can read, you're ready, and you will slip easily through the 1922 English. And so on. So back gradually, imperceptible steps, you won't even notice what you're doing. You go back, say, to 4th century Anglo-Saxon Proto-German, come forward, then in the middle of the book, you reverse direction. Come forward again by imperceptible steps, and you end in 2022 German. Okay, that works. It would have to be a slightly longer book if you have to go, back to Proto-Indo-European and come forward into Urdu, let's say. It would get really tricky if you had to invent the intervening stages, as with English and Mandarin. But first thing first. So that's my scheme to make language learning actually much easier. Just what's been called the Sorites paradox and actually make it work.
Well, yes, because our languages indeed come from somewhere. You know, my
Yeah.
native language is Spanish, and I had the opportunity to study Latin as a kid.
Yeah.
And I remember many of my classmates were like, okay,
Yeah.
why do we study this? I can understand what it said. Like, come on, like, until it gets very advanced, and then you don't understand
Yeah.
anything. But
Yeah.
and then they were suffering. But
Yeah.
but yeah. So in the case of Spanish and Latin, for us, it's very obvious to see. Okay, this is this, this is that.
Yeah.
In English, it's been such a merging experience, let's say, of many influences.
Because I mean, we've got a Latinate layer in our vocabulary.
Yeah.
But that's not always, how shall I say, the first word you'd use.
Exactly. Every time I use, like my partner is British, so
Yeah.
whenever I use a word that is normal for me in Spanish, that I know it exists because of this Latinization of English,
Yeah.
she's like, wow, like very formal, you know?
Oh, you sound very posh. Yeah.
Very, very, very
I
posh.
had this experience some years ago. I had a lovely time in Santiago de Chile. Speaking, I was great,
Yeah.
very hospitably. And I was invited to lecture, and I don't speak Spanish. I can just about, read a bit on the basis of a Latin connection. But so I was invited to speak in English. So I prepared myself, and then I thought, well, actually, I better do quite the opposite of what I do when I'm preparing to speak to English-speaking people in English, which is try and keep it as short words, basic Anglo-Saxon words, un-Latin words as possible. And then I thought, well, that's not going to help people whose first language is Spanish. So I prepared my script, and every juncture I sort of thought, well, how can I put what Latinate word might I use for this? And then I'd check in my Spanish dictionary and find, often enough that Latinate word was in use.
Yes,
So
and it's a normal informal word many times. So.
Yeah, so I wrote myself a script, well, at least many people seem to enjoy it and say they appreciated it. So I think it worked, even though it felt a strange thing to be doing for me.
Yes, so for and again, I'm trying to make these points because this channel has lots of people that are from very, very different backgrounds. Like there's a very strong Greek crowd, let's say, that like the Greek videos, but some others like the philosophy aspects, others a bit of logic. So just to point this out, like we people that do ancient philosophy, in your case professionally, in my case aspiring to be that at this point. One thing that we sort of normalize, but when you get out of this zone of academia, is that it is quite almost mandatory to learn languages, which may sound insane in other branches of philosophy, even if you think about it, where English, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, has dominated the discussions. But this language learning process is something that is so embedded in the experience of doing ancient philosophy, because you need to read articles from people from other places. And they write in their own languages.
I once wrote a note of about a page in Latin. And this was for a Polish journal, and I thought, well, I don't read a word of Polish. If there is, it seems a bit tough to expect them to publish me in English. If there is a second person interested in this point, which was by no means clear, the second person would no doubt be able to understand my Latin. So I am published in Latin as well as English.
Oh, that's so cool. I met a professor in Chile that was like that to give letters of recommendation to a classics department, he wrote the recommendation in Latin.
That's great. So, well, I did have a slightly mischievous undergraduate who was just about to finish her undergraduate course, to go on to do a graduate course in Neo-Latin.
Okay.
So I informed her that I was actually a published Neo-Latin author. Would she like to write her MPhil dissertation on the Neo-Latin works of Nicholas Denyer? And I'm afraid what she said was, yes, but I would have to undertake that whatever she chose to claim about me in this dissertation, to provide evidence in Latin that would support the claims. And I thought this was not a good deal, because who knows what I'd be committing myself to with a mischievous young woman with that extracting such a promise from me. So I can just imagine how it would go. That soon Denyer began to show signs of the senility that was to afflict him. And I'd have to do a little bit of Neo-Latin to support that. That's not a wise idea.
No, but indeed, learning languages is super, super normal, encouraged. And I remember my first supervision meeting was an interview, like, how many languages can you read? That was a direct question. And from that work on to improving
okay. I mean, I'm afraid that is not so in England at the present time. For instance, we used to have knowledge of some language other than English used to be required for getting entry to the University of Cambridge. This has been abandoned in my time because many schools would not teach kids any language English. Yes. So this is rather tough on kids who would go to such a school.
Because it is also this underlying reality, let's say, because correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my impression of the UK, that if you get to be in contact with particularly dead languages, such as like classically labeled as dead languages like Latin or ancient Greek, then normally that school is very posh. That's like an indicator of
it's not absolutely infallible, but it's a pretty good indicator.
Okay. Yes. So in my case in Chile, I was in a very weird school, that it was not posh, but they had their own weird project, let's say, and Latin and French along with English were mandatory. And another weird courses that I am very proud of, but not worth mentioning now. But trust me. So those are the ones that marked me the most in my education, rather than the normal ones. But then the reality in the world, I would say, is to remove more and more both humanities studies, like studies from the humanities, and learning second languages, like on this hope that someday, AI will interpret languages so perfectly that we won't need any languages anymore. That's one of the arguments.
It has come along amazingly, but that has AI. I mean, it can certainly provide a useful clues if you don't quite understand what's going on. But it seems to work best where there's basically where you're not translating natural language at all. I mean, there are things like there's a marvelous air speak, which is a very curtailed version of English, but used for air traffic control to communicate with pilots. And it might be that nobody's first language is English. And you're communicating over possibly a slightly dodgy radio link, and you don't have the cues of visual expression or intonation to help you through. And it might be that you need to communicate very fast. So there's a very pared down version of English for that. So those things which are, they're like more or less like a formal language.
I mean, as long as it's useful, if meaning is the use, as some philosopher may say.